Okay, good morning everyone, and thank you so much for being here today. My name is Neifatu, and I'm a Law and Political Science student at the Complutense University of Madrid, but right now I'm doing my exchange year here in Bergen, and also it's my last week in Norway, so a bit sad. But I'm also a member of the students group at Law Transform, and I'm very happy to be moderating and participating in this seminar. Organizing today's discussion has been a great experience, and I'm especially excited because this is a topic that is deeply important to me. So why this topic? In recent years, the European Union has increasingly relied on what we know as external migration policies. These are strategies designed to manage migration beyond EU borders by partnering with countries of origin and transit, especially in Africa, to control mobility, limit irregular migration, and address the root causes of displacement. And this process of externalization involves a wide range of measures: border reinforcement, readmission agreements, return programs, and information campaigns aimed to deter immigration. And also development aid is often used as a tool to incentivize cooperation. And West Africa and countries like Ghana, Senegal, Niger have become key partners in these efforts. But these policies are not just technical. They reshape migration routes, influence local governance, and have a strong impact on how people in the region perceive mobility, opportunity, and also Europe itself. So this is why it's so important to look at the consequences, not only in terms of EU policy goals, but also from the perspective of African state and local communities. So today we will reflect on the social, political, and legal implications of these externalization strategies, what narratives are produced and challenged on the ground, on how is aid used to influence migration governance, and what does this mean for sovereignty, dignity, and justice. So we will have two fantastic speakers who will guide us through these questions. First, we have Catherine Talleras. She's a senior researcher at the CMI, and she's a political geographer focusing on migration, development, and governance. She leads the EFFEXT project and on the effects of EU externalization in Africa and Middle East. And then we have also Elin Sonneland, if I'm not wrong, and he is a senior researcher also here, and is an expert on development cooperation and African politics with more than 30 years of experience in the field. And also myself, as someone with a personal connection with West Africa. I'm from Senegal, and I will contribute with just some reflections on how externalization policies shape imaginaries and daily life in Senegal. And before we start, I would like to show you a short video. This video was recorded in Bur, one of the main departure ports for migrant boats in Senegal to the Canarian Islands. And while it doesn't directly address the EU external migration policies, it highlights one of the indirect consequences, that is the desperate journeys that many young people take when they are left with no legal alternatives to emigrate. As routes by land becomes increasingly closed off and militarized, and as legal pathways there is a lack of them, some are left with no choice but to risk their lives in the sea. So this video also connects to a reflection I will offer later on the popular Senegalese expression Barça ou Barsac, Barcelona or the afterlife, and how this mindset emerged from deep structural and policy-driven constraints on mobility. And after the video, Catherine will begin by helping us understanding what these externalization policies are. She will do it through the lens of her work in the EFFEXT project. And then we will open the floor to a broader conversation, bringing Elin's perspective of development aid and how these intersect with the migration strategies. So before we begin, I would like to give some few practical notes. This event is being recorded and streamed, and also we will take some pictures for communication. So if anyone don't want to appear in these pictures, just let us know. And also there will be a Q&A at the end, and for those who are joining online, feel free to put the questions in the chat and we will read them at the end of during the discussion. So I hope these dialogues bring a lot of knowledge to us, and I hope we enjoy this hour.
So thanks again everyone for coming, and thanks to Nai. I must say before I start, I'm really impressed by Nai, who's been organizing this entire seminar on her own as an undergrad student. It's very impressive and I really appreciate it. It's highly professional, so thank you. It's also very nice to get an opportunity to talk about a project I've been working on for a few years. I've presented on this everywhere else, but here in Bergen at CMI, so it's nice to have the opportunity to do so. Let's see how this works. Yeah. So I wanted to say a bit about the project that is around this research that I've done, and then I'll go into some of the research findings focusing on West Africa. So as Nay said at the beginning, this is a bigger project focusing on externalization policies, and then looking at not how they are organized or made, but the implications on the ground in partner countries in Africa and the Middle East. And as we know, preventing irregular migration is a key priority, and there has been a lot of research on the effects of it, for instance, how this has changed migration flows on the ground or not, decreased migration intentions or aspirations, and so on. But there hasn't really been too much research, or at least when we started this project, on the more social, on the ground, local, a bit more tangible, felt experiences of externalization. So that was what we wanted to do as part of the project, and I think we have some interesting findings. And another thing to say at the start here is that the idea of externalization policies, which Elling also will touch upon later on, is a bit paradoxical in itself, because a lot of these initiatives are funded by development aid budgets, yet migration is seen as a super important element. It's part of development processes in many countries, especially in Africa. And whether it's irregular or not, that's something that can be questioned and discussed. And what is irregular migration? These kind of questions. But we'll get back to these questions towards the end. So first, for the project, we've had a big team of researchers based in Europe, the Nordic countries, and also all our case countries, focusing on 6 different countries. So for this talk, I will talk primarily about Senegal, Ghana, and I can touch upon Ethiopia too, and Libya perhaps, but not Jordan and Lebanon. So the questions we set out to ask and to answer, I'll read some of them. So what are these states? So the partner states' past and current priorities on migration. How do these priorities develop? When and why do some governments engage with the European Union or European states in managing migration? And if they do, when are these policies implemented or not? And when they are implemented, what's the interplay between the implemented policies and the local dynamics, so going all the way down? And how do these externalization measures affect how migration management is understood? So the major question grasping all of this for the project was, how do key stakeholders, now thinking about governments, but also important NGOs and so on, in Africa and the Middle East, navigate these competing global and perhaps different national priorities when it comes to migration management? But today we're focusing on a more narrow part of this, talking about the implications, local implications of EU external migration policies in West Africa. Sorry. So I wanted to show with this, start with this picture. It's of EU representative from the EU, a program working on, funded by what was called the European Union Trust Fund for Africa, which was a major development aid instrument targeting primarily irregular migration. and one of the beneficiaries in Ghana who was an NGO leader working in the area of vocational training and so on. So they had, he was one of the people receiving quite a lot of funding from the European Union. So a very specific example. I will get more into that later on. But what I'll talk about is something that if you're interested, you can read more about it in 3 different articles. And this also says a bit, I think the articles are good examples for this, because externalization is so wide, it's so broad, it encompasses a lot of different policy areas. So for one of these, the focus is on exactly this type of development-oriented initiatives. A second, which I've written with my colleague who just left, Arne Wiig, is focusing on information campaigns, which is European information provision about the dangers of irregular migration, opportunities for legal migration, and so on, a very different instrument. And then finally also one on border control strengthening, which has the aim of affecting how and if and when and who can cross different borders within Africa. So not from Europe, not from Africa to Europe necessarily, but also changing how border control is practiced on the ground. So this is based on fieldwork in a couple of years back, where me and my colleague Leander Kandilige, we interviewed 65 different stakeholders in Ghana across different ministry units, also some NGOs, some working in bigger organizations, but all of them were representatives of the Ghanaian point of departure viewpoints. So we didn't really look into the EU representatives and what they thought in Ghana, because a lot of research has been actually covering that already. We also talked with 40 beneficiaries, meaning people on the ground who were affected by some of these different mechanisms, including some focus group discussions and so on, with men and women living different places, mostly in the, well, Kumasi, some Tamale, some Accra, but in the middle stretch. And then we did a survey focusing specifically on these information campaign instruments, an experimental survey also 2 years back. So yes, just also to give you a few more examples of what kind of policies we talk about here, I want to look into some of them that have again been covered by this EU Emergency Trust Fund for Africa. And there's quite many millions that's gone to Ghana specifically over the past year. These are just a few, so this one, sorry for the text, it's a bit small. Focusing on strengthening border security in Ghana. And this is often, some of the names of these policies are often about, they are the same, but if you look at the details, they are a bit different. So this one is really to reducing irregular migration through targeted capacity building, improve facilities or border control checkpoints, and so on across the entire border in Ghana. And before taking the next, I think it's also important to say as a reminder that when we talk about migration in West Africa and we talk about externalization policies, it's easy to think that migration to Europe is a big thing. But for Ghana, for instance, and most of the countries in West Africa, the main migration is regional, and it has been for ages. It's part of everyday lives. People travel seasonal. They can also go to the capitals or bigger cities, and that is what we think about as migration in that context. But the externalization policies are meant to affect migration from Africa to Europe, but may also, as a result, as we'll talk about, affect regional migration. Some other examples where it's collaborative border management between countries. Here is the unit that is in charge of controlling the borders of Ghana. It's called the Ghana Immigration Service, GIS. It's a growing organization that has been growing from a very, very limited number of people working there in the early 2000s, just a few hundreds, to now encompassing closer to 20,000 individuals. Parts of this also because of a lot of funds and support from European Union member states and the EU. Of course, a great asset also for Ghana to strengthen the border control, but there are some challenges there too. But that's also one of the kind of major recipients of this border control strengthening funds that has come from the EUTF. Another part of this is that NGOs on the ground have received support. So even though this is focused on border control, many of these NGOs, they work, for instance, with migration, information provision, making online media, Facebook campaigns, these kind of things, and also more vocational training, giving people education, enabling them to have these work programs, a lot of different initiatives. So this is just one example where 4 received some money to help strengthen border security, but in alternative ways in a way. So yeah, including the example I mentioned at the beginning. So here, to look into this, I wanted to first talk a bit about these vocational training, development kind of oriented programs. And me and my colleague, we went around and talked with quite a few of these different NGO leaders, some of them old, some of them new, working in the field of migration. And here is one we visited just to show this is the typical kind of activity that they would arrange. Training here for young women who were potential to be migrants. And men, different opportunities that were of relevance in the local communities and so on. But what I think is a bit interesting, so here's the logo of one of these organizations. It's a small, so I'll read it up, and here you can see this is the garden of the organization. So the aim is to focus on, the name is the Returnee Migrants Rehabilitation Center for promoting of reintegration. So it's focusing on return and reintegration of migrants coming back and minimizing irregular migration to Europe. And as it says in the end, Kayaye. And Kayaye, it's a local term for a specific type of internal migration, especially where young women, but also young men, go from the rural areas to the major cities to work as head porters, also doing other kind of irregular works, seen by many as very dangerous. They're in a vulnerable position, but also by some as really needed and a part of, for instance, a transition ritual to adulthood. You have to do something, you may go there. But for this organization, they focused on the negative implications, which are really there. And I think the merging of these 3 very different, actually, focus areas of policy into one was something that several NGOs did. And I think a thing to mention here is that, and we were told by many NGO leaders that they were a bit afraid now because some of these organizations who had been working for a long time, for instance, on return and reintegration, which has been a key priority for the EU longer than some of the other policy areas, they now saw that there was popping up a lot of different new organizations focusing on it, trying to get these finances to start their own NGOs. So it was a little bit more of a competition internally. Perhaps logos like this, trying to stretch all over, is a way to get as much funds as you need to carry out the activities that you want to do on the ground. But still, the activities that they actually did were not so migration targeted. Vocational training in a rural area with a lot of unemployment, lower lack of education is something that is relevant not only to potential migrants or return migrants, but for the entire populations. So in that sense, it doesn't really differ that much from another development-oriented organization or NGO, although the focus is on migration here and the aims and so on. I also wanted to show an insight from Oxfam report that was made a few years back on the EUTF, because there has, of course, been some criticism, which we maybe all of you know, towards these kind of externalization policies. So they found, I'll read it here, our review of all the project proposals funded by the EUTF for Africa expose a new and worrying trajectory for development aid that is more closely linked with donors' migration policies, particularly stopping irregular migration. This poses a risk to development actors' ability to contribute to poverty and inequality reduction. So this is something that has been repeated in different reports of the EUTF for Africa and also other specific policy instruments from the EU. So it was not a surprising to us that we also found some of the same findings on the ground in our research. So some of the on-the-ground impacts, and here this comes from the interviews and focus groups with these beneficiaries, and also the people working in these types of organizations, was that there was an impact on unemployment rates, so less unemployment among the targeted beneficiaries. Of course, if you get a job, then you're not unemployed anymore. But as with many other instruments, it was temporal and highly uncertain whether it required, for instance, additional funds and so on to stay on. You needed more equipment. If you didn't get the equipment, then you couldn't do the job. There was also brought up this idea of the selection criteria. So these were opportunities given only to people who fit the category, so for migrants. So in a neighborhood, they would go around. I have one specific organization in mind now who really talked about this, where you had a lot of youth going to schools. They had some information campaigns, and then they said, are there anyone here who have thought about migrating? And here again, this division between internal and externally. And then, of course, yes, maybe, going to Accra, the capital. And then they were selected to be included in some of these vocational training programs, giving extra opportunities, while the others who hadn't thought about that or didn't raise their hand, they were excluded. So this was something that was brought up, especially by the people working there, that it felt awkward to select some over others and not taking those in most need, but those with a migration intention. Of course, the overall aim of these kind of policies from a European perspective is to affect migration practices and aspirations. And here there was a lot of variations. Yes, for some, they felt that it really affected them because they didn't have to go. Others say, yes, this is just giving me some an opportunities for a few years, and then I will see what I do, and it really doesn't affect what I do, whether I migrate or not. And this disconnect in understanding irregular migration, so lots of fund focusing on irregular migration, was then spent on internal migration, which is, per definition, not irregular migration in terms of the legal requirements. So it needs to be crossing an international border without permit, then it is irregular. But here, irregular was seen as also dangerous. So thus, KAE was included. Also this, as you can read more about in the specific article on information campaigns, there are two different types of campaigns that are carried out by many of these organizations. One more focusing on the dangers of crossing, like we saw, that are very real in the video showed at the beginning. A newer form of campaign are those that focus on the opportunities at home. Look, rather stay in Ghana or stay in Senegal. It's fantastic here. Look at all the abilities you have, because there was a lot of criticism towards these dangerous journeys kind of oriented videos that really tried to use scaring as an element to make people stay. So what we found is that, because we wanted to look at whether these types of campaigns affected people's attitudes to each other within a local community, and we didn't find very strong results on overall attitudes, but we did find that those campaigns that focused on the local opportunities did increase the local criticism towards unskilled migrants. So there was something going on there on the ground, which I think is something that we should look more into. There was also some organizational concerns in these organizations. So, for instance, there was a challenge with the decreased funding from the European Union, more directed towards migration. But I guess this is general for also other NGOs, not just those that are migrant-oriented. And many mentioned this change is in the chain of command. So while they before had received a bit more freedom in what to do, now a lot of this was instrumentalized through the IOM or ICMPD, which is also a big organization working on migration governance, which gave them less freedom in deciding how to spend the money on the ground. This creation of a migration management NGO market, and then sustainability challenges, as we saw that it was very, or we were told that people got funds for a big new project, they did it, and then the funds were done and they couldn't carry out with the activity. So there was some sustainability challenges with the increased and continued dependency, as we already know. I think it's a general trait here, but also for the migration-oriented NGOs. So I'll quickly mention a different example, focusing now on more the implications of border control, more targeted. So some of the examples I gave at the beginning really have focused on this capacity building, having more staff, having better surveillance equipment in borders in Ghana, also other countries, but here in Ghana. Ghana has three borders towards 3 neighboring countries where all of them have been strengthened over the past years with these external funds. So with the fieldwork, the data covers 6 different border checkpoints at all these 3 borders. I went to 5 of them myself, and also some unauthorized border crossing areas, because the borders in West Africa are highly porous. So on the picture here on the right is a good example. It's just a local village, and somewhere in it is the border between a country, between 2 of these countries. And the other one is at the checkpoint where it's not like a typical US-Mexico border kind of picture. It's possible to cross, but of course people and people cross in different ways. Some where they live without registering, and there are different regulations for different people and so on. But I just wanted to show these pictures as examples so you can sort of visualize how they look. There are also bigger, major checkpoints that are really, really big and not something that we, for instance, could take photos of and show because of security issues, but where you really see a lot of instruments and high-level tech, parking lots, of course, customs are always there. So it's a lot of things going on some of these more major border crossing places. But without focusing on like the what was included in the different projects, I'm just going straight to the implications. So you can see that, yes, of course, with all these investments, there have been major modernization and expansion and professionalization of border control. But this has come at a cost. But first, in terms of what it has led to, which we can see as a positive contribution, is that there has been a lot of training going on, capacity building, new infrastructures, new vehicles, range of different cars with the GIS and the EU logo and the IOM logo around, equipment, computers, all these things. Really, really a lot. Now I haven't been there. Like I wasn't there for 15 years ago. It would have been interesting if I was, because then I could have seen the changes. But of course you can see when it's brand new, shining equipment. Also observed improvements. This is not my observations, but the people I spoke with, like the border control staff and also some of the border crosses, with enhanced routines in terms of patrolling the border. More people were traveling together. You need special cars, motorbikes, and so on to travel in some of these regions to really make sure that no one crosses, biometric systems, and so on. But again, which is also not as surprising but interesting to see on the ground, that some of these materials provided were really not relevant, right? Which you could see because some of the vehicles were just stranded. If the terrain is very demanding, you don't need a normal car. You need a what is it called? 4x4, thank you, and so on. Which also made that some of these equipments and things were really not used. So there were big computers in one office. I remember there were like 3 different computers, a desk, a registration desk to register and check biometric data. But the officers, they used pen and paper because a lack of electricity. So they had some issues with the data, computers that they couldn't solve, and so on. And that was just how it was, but of course nice with the computers, but not really used. Of course this was not the case everywhere, but enough to mention it here, to say it like that. Yes, also lack of fuel, for instance. The fuel is super expensive, but it's great with cars, but if you don't have money for fuel, you can't drive around. So some of these modernizations and professionalizations that were good, but also not super adequate. Again, here was also mentioned what we saw in these NGO programs with the reinforced reliance on external support. So getting some also mean that you need it to be taken care of. So this externally funded inputs were central for them to do their day-to-day operations, and risk of donor-led development. So I read through the different GIS annual reports. They've been going on for 2 decades, and they've mentioned in their documents more and more that there is a risk of not us being in charge of how we develop things, but the discussions are donor-led. And GIS is a critical, important institution in Ghana, in charge of the Ghanaian surveillance in terms of border control. So it's that's an interesting and strong statement that it's in their own documents. And then to these more local implications of this. Another thing that we saw and observed was that while criminalization of irregular migration is part of what this meant with these policies, we also saw that the increased focus on irregular migration and dangerous migration affected the border controllers to an extent that they also stopped other people. For instance, people who had their documents in place also were going to areas where it wasn't necessarily negative to go in a European perspective. So more specifically, there has been a lot of focus on migration to Libya over the past years. So Libya is somewhere you shouldn't go, it's dangerous, and of course then it is dangerous. Also in Ghana it's been a lot of focus on this. It's challenging for people, Ghanaians, to go to Libya. But from a European perspective, many of those going to Libya have been having the aim of going to Europe. So then they wanted to stop these kind of migrations. But with that in mind, it meant that the border controllers also stopped Ghanaians going, for instance, to Nigeria, because they said, well, maybe you're going to Libya. And that is a breach with the Ghanaian constitution, because all Ghanaians should be allowed to leave their country, and also human rights, of course. There's also a shift in local dynamics, where the border controllers had a different role in the local communities, more police-oriented. And we saw these local rippling effects, as we call them, are also then cross-scalar, because it affects the reinforced new colonial power asymmetries and then reshape governance structures on the ground. So these local effects are really bigger when you look at the totality of them. So just finishing swiftly with this slide, that what we find analytically is that when we do this kind of research, we shouldn't just look at the effects, how it's measured, how migration flows are affected, but targeted look for more of these rippling effects that we call them. To use that as an analytical tool to capture these cross-scalar consequences, move beyond traditional binaries of a successful policy or an unsuccessful policy, but look more into it, focusing on, in Africa, Afrocentric, historized and grounded perspectives. So, and of course, we'll have an article on this coming out soon, so you can all look forward to that one. So thank you. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much for your presentation. I think it was a good introduction to what is this topic, and also I really like it how you explained your experience there and the local experience, so it's really interesting. And before continuing, I would like to just briefly share a short reflection that I have. Of course, not as a researcher because I'm just a 20-year-old student, so. But it's because I was talking with a friend and he told me that political scientists shouldn't, if they want to learn about the immigration policies, they should focus also in the cultural, emotional, and the human dimensions behind them. And that is really something that I really consider important. So that's why I wanted to come with the expression Barça u Barsac. And this phrase means Barcelona or the afterlife, and it reflects the powerful mix in the hopes, despair, determination, and it's about living no matter the risk, because staying feels like no longer living. So it comes from the urban neighborhoods in Dakar and surrounding areas like Pekin, Guédiawaye, and Charoy. And even though it references Barcelona, it's not exactly about Spain, it's just Europe as a whole. And some people say that the link to Barcelona is because the football team, like being a football player, make it big. But today is more than that. It's like trying to reach a place that represents a better life. And in Islamic culture, Barsac means the space between life and death, the short spiritual limbo. So when people refer to that phrase, it's not just a slogan, it's a life or death decision. So it's a metaphor that, of course, shows us how migration is seen as the only way to live and survive. So I was thinking, how does this phrase connect with the EU externalization policies? And after speaking with friends that are living in Senegal and have take that trip to go to Spain by the sea, I try to reflect and I end up with 4 main ideas that more or less you have also mentioned. But first, the policies don't eliminate, of course, the desire to migrate. The structural reasons are still there, like the unemployment, inequality, lack of opportunities, lack of visas are still there, and in fact they can also become worse. Some people are pushed to leave because the consequences of some European countries' agreements that affect the local economy, like for example in Senegal, we have the European fisheries license that are from some European countries that are affecting the Senegalese fishermen who has lost their main source of income. So people still want to live, and also they need to live to have a better life. And second, as you mentioned, the migration becomes more dangerous because the safer and traditional routes are being closed due to the border control, and also people feel forced to take more dangerous paths because, as we know, the land routes are being closed or militarized with the EU funds for, like Frontex, for example, and the only option leaves is the sea, and that is when the tragedy begins. And third, I think that these policies also try to shape how people see the migration, as you have mentioned with Libya and the local communities, like the associations that are trying to show that migration is something really dangerous. I have seen videos of Italian association about migrants saying, "Don't go, you will become a slave." And I think that these pictures of videos can be painful for those who only see migration as not only as a choice but as a way to survive and protect their families. And finally, I think that also creates tension in local communities, because when arrests and interceptions happen with the support of EU funding, citizens might feel that the government is not working for them, is working for European interest. I think that this can create frustration, mistrust, and resentment. So what happens with Warsaw-Warsaw is that it doesn't disappear, it becomes stronger because the reasons haven't gone. So the pathway become more dangerous and criminalized and more invisible. So that's why many people end up turning to mafias and paying big amounts of money, as we have seen in the video before. And it's also because there isn't any legal way to come to Europe to emigrate. I have talked with people and they told me that if they had the chance to just get a simple visa to come to Europe, see how things go, see if they can find a job, and if not, just go back, they will do that. They wouldn't risk their lives. But after taking that dangerous path and surviving to all the trauma, going back no longer feels like an option. So basically, externalization policies, of course, may aim to stop migration. But for many young Senegalese people, Warsaw-Warsaw is not just a phrase, it's the reality that shapes when hope is blocked and desperation remains. So after this, I think that the development aid is something that is crucial in this topic. So we have here an expert on this field, and I would like to ask you more in general, what role does development aid play in migration challenge and responding to migration?
Thank you, and thank you, Nick, for inviting me to this interesting seminar. Before I answer your question, I just want to make an important point, which you also hinted at, and that is when we're talking about development aid, and that is a funding mechanism also to deal with externalization, migration control, and so on. We should keep in mind that we do other things outside the aid budget, which has far bigger impact, usually negative, on migration. We spend more money on bombing Libya than we've spent on limiting migration, but the effects of the Libya bombing was far bigger. Trade policy limits opportunities to growth, as you mentioned out. Fishery policies, the role of long-distance fishery fleets from Spain or from China has a devastating impact on local fishing communities in West Africa and in East Africa. So that's part of the picture too. Development aid. Of course, you know, it has a long history. It was motivated by the thinking that rich countries should provide a share of their wealth towards improving living conditions in poor countries. And it was something that was provided a bit separated from other foreign policy priorities, because in the old days developing country was not that important in foreign policy of the aid providing countries. But that of course has changed over the past 20-30 years, and there has also been a kind of a mission creep when it comes to the purpose of providing development aid. Today a large amount of aid is provided to deal with the climate challenges. We had, following 9/11 and the bombing in New York, we had a new emphasis on fighting terror, providing stabilization to conflict-affected countries, which in recent years has been reinforced also by Islamic terror or perceived Islamic terror in the Middle East, North Africa. And we've had an increasing emphasis on preventing people from the south of coming to the north and to Europe, in particular the externalisation approach, which is also coupled with an emphasis on finding ways and means of not just strengthening the European borders, but also in sending back people, irregular migrants who come to Europe. Let me jump to the Norwegian role in all of this. And I would say that Norway historically you haven't paid much attention to migration to the extent that we have, especially in Africa. It has been about providing support to migrating communities, to ease migration, to see it as a resource for development. And this is manifested in support addressing, the issue of rural-urban migration, easing border controls, allowing people to commute across borders. Southern Africa, for example, which is the other hub of migration, it's not just the EU, but people are also moving south. The issue has been around how can you make border controls easier to facilitate not just people moving across borders, but there's all sort of associated activities, small-scale traders moving back and forth, and of course it's the huge plans to stimulate trade between African countries. Then you don't need stiff border controls. You need to make it easier to move. So that has been historically what has informed Norwegian thinking and aid when it comes to migration. Things started to change and a new dynamic came into this in the 1990s, and that was refugees coming to Norway. The first was the wave of refugees from the Balkan Wars with the fall of Yugoslavia. And at the time it was decided that one could use the development aid budget to cover the cost of hosting those refugees. That was a big item on the aid budget in the 90s. Then came the refugees from Syria in 2015, which had another dramatic impact on the aid budget. And then, of course, the last 2 years, refugees from Ukraine. So we could use the aid budget to cover the costs of hosting them in Norway, at least for the first year. There was a parallel discussion around 20 years ago with the first Stoltenberg government. Erik Solheim and Jonas Gahr Støre were in charge. They were a bit also informed about global debates about migrants being a resource for development. So there were discussions, how can we make it easier for migrants to send money back to families and communities in the countries where they were coming from. There was an idea that you could engage with immigrant communities in Norway and make them a resource for development also in their home countries. Somalia was an important example in the early days. But it quickly, not much came out of it, but although remittances are important, Somalia, for example, is an important partner country for Norwegian development aid, but the remittances from the Somalis in Norway is bigger than the total aid provided to that country. But it shifted towards an increasing emphasis on limiting supporting the EU and limiting migration to Europe and to Norway and to send people back. And this gained momentum about 10 years ago when one started to use the aid not just to fund or to cover the costs of hosting refugees, but also to use the Norwegian aid budget to work in refugee sending, countries sending migrants to Europe and to Norway. And it's no surprise perhaps that this happened around 2014-15, and for those of you, we had a series of ministers of justice in those days, and they were campaigning very hard to stop that. And they single out the Horn of Africa as an example, where they were going to. They said to use aid as a stick. If you don't limit people from leaving your country, and if you don't accept that we send you people back, we will cut down on aid. Or even stop it. And then, you know, the minister or the deputy minister at the time, Kallemyr, even went to on a tour of these countries to impose that. But the first big lesson from that is that African governments are not just passive institutions sitting there and do as they're being told. They turn around, they try and use it to something positive, and are more interested in the carrot than the stick. And what came out of it was, you know, in a sense, the Norwegian bilateral externalisation policy. They received money channeled through the IOM and so on to support immigration facilities in control in Mogadishu, in Somalia. Norway paid for a new fancy building, provided salaries for staff and so on. They set up a border post on the border between Somalia and Ethiopia and things like that. Over the last 3 or 4 years, the current government came to the table when they launched their government on a platform which provided, which promised to provide more funds from the aid budget for limiting and dealing with illegal migration in Norway. Not much came out of that because, as you know, shortly thereafter we had the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and that took away a lot of the attention. But what Norway did was that the main manifestation was to provide money to international organizations, primarily the IOM, the 2 UN agencies, the International Organization of Migration and the UN High Commissioner of Refugees, and they received more money. And then, of course, Norway also provided funding, for the first time actually, to the EU's aid budget, the trust fund that Katrine talked about. The most interesting thing, though, is a policy which was introduced by the Progress Party and Solberg government 10 years ago, which has been continued, and it's interesting to see how that's managed. That is the use of the Ministry of Justice and the Immigration Department, because they get a bag of money every year from the aid budget to spend, and there is no involvement by aid officials or political assessments of the development impact of what they do. It is the ministries dealing with migration, mainly the justice, but also the family and education ministry and so on, under the auspices of the Ministry of Finance. They meet quarterly to make assessment of the expected number of immigrants and refugees coming to Norway in the coming year, and then the Ministry of Finance will instruct the Foreign Ministry to set aside funding to cover that in the raid budget. And the Ministry of Justice and the other ministries will then invoice the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for an amount, and the money will be transferred. And that's the amount of involvement by the aid system in Norway. It's usually nearly everything is spent on covering the costs of hosting people in Norway, but there is a small amount managed by the Ministry of Justice that is used to provide support for border control, immigration authorities in sending countries, Somalia, Ethiopia, and elsewhere. And of course, you're talking big money in the sense that covering the costs of refugees is 4 or 5 billion Norwegian kroner from the aid budget, mostly for Ukraine. 19,000 refugees from Ukraine last year, 4,000 from other countries, mostly people coming from Syria on family reunification. And most interestingly and disturbing perhaps is that in the past we've always sort of made space for allowing Norway to receive a number of quota refugees or resettlement refugees, people living in refugee camps managed by the UN. That's been a few thousand, but last year the government proposed that because of the large number of Ukrainians, this year in 2025 we will only accommodate 200 quota refugees. The parliament increased that to 500. That was a long response to your question, but perhaps just one final thing that Norway is doing outside the aid budget, and that is something, the English term for that is called the state grants. And that is what Norway, as a part of the European Economic Area, we have a cooperation agreement with Liechtenstein and Iceland, with the EU. And as part of that, Norway provides a few billion every year to cover fund projects in poorer European countries. And some of that has also gone into providing support for border control and asylum centers and so on in those EU countries. The big question though is of course what is happening to all of this when aid budgets are shrinking. UN agencies like the IOM and UN High Commissioner for Refugees are facing cuts in their aid budget. EU will have to provide more to Ukraine and so on, but that's another issue. Thank you.
Thank you. So I don't know if you want to add something or we can start the Q&A.
Maybe as just a quick comment, I think it's very interesting to have this Norwegian perspective on things, because it also mirrors a lot. I mean, the reason why migration has been included and can be included on the development agenda is also because it's included in the Sustainable Development Goals. It wasn't in the Millennium Goals. A potential reason for that is that given this increased pressure of, as you say, refugees, but also irregular migrants, the political focus more specifically on this in Europe in the years leading up to 2015, and also then in 2015 showed that there was a lack of, there was a challenge, a major challenge for Europe to actually manage its own borders and collaborate and to have policies on this. Thus, as a result, there has been a lot of global work on this, where migration has been included in a global agenda on migration. We have a global agenda on refugees, which came partly because Europe had this capacity and control problem. This then happened at the same time as migration was included in the SDGs for different reasons, but also then with this focus on migration in a specific way, so safe, orderly, and regular. Yes, facilitating legal migration opportunities is still there, but this massive focus on what we should avoid, irregular migration, was then in the development agenda, which gave European countries and Europe a reason for why development aid budgets also could be spent on it in a different way than before, where it was more about facilitating internal improving channels for sending remittances and so on. So this very Norwegian local political developments is a parallel and result in a way of what has happened on the global scale here. So it's super interesting to hear.
Sure. Yeah, so we can start if anyone has a question.
I think there would have to be one question because we're over time.
Yeah.
Okay.
So one.
Sorry.
We can do one.
Maybe.
You sure?
You don't have it.
Okay.
If there are two, come on.
Okay. Yeah, I have lots, but I'll pick one for time. Really interesting. Very, very good. You talked about how the structural reasons are still there. In a really quick answer, how do you think we can address those structural issues? Or what's one thing that you think we should do in one sentence?
For who is the question?
For you, the expert.
I think my question is actually about mostly about the effects, because while what I found interesting in terms of the results of the project is about the effect of this EU externalisation policies in regional migration flows. And while we were presenting, I was actually thinking that it is considered that West Africa in general, through ECOWAS Protocol of Free Movement, have one of the most comprehensive protocols in terms of migration, regional migration in the continent. And I was thinking that, for example, when you're mentioning the migration to Nigeria being restricted because of the new policies, I was thinking about the contradictions in terms of these policies, and also about, of course, contradiction with, the precedence of having people in West Africa. We really know about people actually moving for a long time, but not being really static communities. So I was thinking if you can at least explain a little bit more about this this contradiction between having regional agreement and then these international, at least policies of these international agreements between the countries in West Africa and EU migration policies.
Yeah, I will answer the short question. And also you can answer. Okay, I think in Senegal the main problem right now is with the fish. If you go to Spain and you ask any Senegalese that has come recently, he will tell you that he was a fisherman. And the problem right now is that there is a lot of European countries that are having license with the Senegalese government, and these European countries are coming with big boats and taking almost all the fish, while the local fishermen that were going with just small boats to just take fish for the week or for some days, they are not able to do that. So right now I think that there is a lack of fish, so they don't have money. They are not able to work, so they don't earn money, and they are not able to maintain the family.
Also quickly say that it's interesting to really look into these discrepancies between global and European African collaboration and the focus there, and what is happening regionally in Africa, so in ECOWAS but also IGAD and the AU in general, where there's been a lot of focus and work and progress on facilitating free movement for economic reasons, but this has been hampered for different reasons. Perhaps one of them, yes, is this these parallel discourses going on. But also, more importantly, lack of funds to really focus on this work on implementing the free mobility regime in ECOWAS, for instance, where potentially more funds were also coming from donors in the past, not so much on that anymore. Yet many of these funds on controlling and border control is also seen by those who receive them as a potential tool of improving free mobility, because you need free mobility, but it should be regulated, right? But that is not what we see now. So we see regulation of, in terms of decreasing irregular movement, not necessarily helping to facilitate it. But yeah, I'm happy to talk more about it outside. Yeah.
So we can close the seminar, and thank you so much for coming today, and I hope you really enjoyed and learned a lot as I did. So we can continue the discussion later with the croissants.